Okay, we'll go ahead and get started with our session tonight. So, sure, as everyone has probably seen, tonight's topic is about match play versus stroke play. Two forms of play that most of us typically play, whether we play as an individual or a partner, or we play Stableford or some other version of these formats. Really, it all boils down to either one or the other, match play or stroke play. So, luckily, as most rules cover different topics, we have an entire rule dedicated to these two forms of play. Rule 3, the competition. So a few outlines of what Rule 3 encompasses. We'll talk about match play versus stroke play, the differences in these two forms of play. There is some key differences between match play and stroke play, namely having to deal with getting the ball in the hole, a few rules that only apply in one form of play or the other, and dealing with the scorecard as well. So there's our outline for the next hour. So again, we'll talk about all central elements of competitions, match play or stroke play, whether we're playing as an individual or a partner, gross or net scoring. In match play, determining the hole in the match results. We have concessions in match play, something we don't have in stroke play, the ability to concede either the hole, the match, or a stroke. Applying handicaps in match play, the responsibilities of the player and the opponents. And in stroke play, we have a winner. We have a winner in match play as well. There's usually someone that wins the match. Sometimes we tie, but typically in match play, we have a winner. But we also have a winner in stroke play as well. We have scorecards in stroke play. There's something in stroke play that we have that is not in match play, and that's the scorecard. And we also have to hole out in stroke play. Like I mentioned before, we have concessions in match play where we can concede the next stroke that our opponent might have. That opponent doesn't have to put that stroke out. However, in stroke play, we got to get the ball in the hole. There is a very key part of stroke play, and we'll see in Rule 3.3 that we have to get that ball in the hole. We have a purpose statement for the competition. So Rule 3 covers 3 central elements of all golf competitions. We saw this a little bit on the previous slide. We're either playing match play or stroke play. There's one or the other, one of those two forms of play. And we're either playing by ourselves or we have a partner as part of a side. We have 2 forms of play that are covered by Rules 23 and 22, 4-ball and foursomes. And we're either scoring by gross scores, we have no handicap strokes applied to our round, or we're scoring by net scores, where we're using our handicap to either get strokes on certain holes or give strokes away to our opponent if we're playing match play. So we have a definition of match play. We'll see a few definitions here in the next couple slides where we have a definition of match play. The match play tells us it's a form of play where we're either playing as an individual or a side directly against an opponent or an opposing side. That's really key difference between match play and stroke play. When we talk about having an opponent in one of these forms of play, when we use the word opponents, that's only referring to match play. We don't have an opponent in stroke play. So when we talk specifically about an opponent or an opposing side, we know we're dealing with the form of match play. And we do it by winning holes or we're winning a match. We win holes by completing it in fewer strokes than our opponent or the opposing side. And we win the match by winning more holes than our opponent or the opposing side. And then we see the match is won by when we lead the opponent or opposing side by more holes than remain to be played. This isn't quite a definition, but we see the word player in the rules of golf quite a bit. Again, it's when we flip to the definitions portion of the book, we're not going to see a defined term that says player. That's why it's technically in orange. But we see it in the rules, and it's used to define the person we're dealing with the rules. We use it both in match play and stroke play. And it refers to any golfer that it could be an opponent, could be a partner, could be the members of the side, or it could be the person that we're dealing with in that specific rule situation. Again, like I mentioned before, opponent only applies in match play. We do not have an opponent in stroke play. Typically, when we're talking about stroke play, and we'll see that, like I said, when we get to Rule 3.3, when we talk about people in stroke play, they're usually other players in stroke play is how we refer to them. They're also an outside influence if we want to really nail them down to a specific definition. But when we're talking about an opponent, like I said, we're only dealing with match play. And like we mentioned before, we could be playing with a partner as a part of a side if we're playing in foursomes or four ball. We have two or more partners competing as a single unit, and it could be in both match play or stroke play. We could have both forms of play dealing with sides of players. But a side is not the same as a team. We have team competitions and we have competitions where we're dealing with sides. Those two things are not the same. A side, like we saw on the previous slide, is a set of partners where in four ball, they're either playing their own ball, or in foursomes, they're playing one ball alternating those strokes. So a side is not the same as when we say a team. Team competitions, we could have a lot of individuals playing with each other as part of a team and all those scores counting towards a team, but they're still playing either individual match play or individual stroke play. So match play, we can play as a singles match where one person plays against one opponent. We see in the middle there, we see the Three Stooges. We can play a three-ball match, which is a form of match play where there are three players playing individual matches against each other. The player A is playing a match against player B and player C. Player B is playing a match against player A and player C, and player C is playing a match against player A and player B. So a lot of things going on when we have a three-ball match. Or we can have a foursomes match or a four-ball match where we have those sides of two partners together. Stroke play is a bit different. It's, again, we can either play as a player playing individually or as a side. But unlike in match play, when we're playing an opponent or an opposing side, we're playing against the field. We're playing against everybody else on the golf course and all other players playing in that competition or other sides playing in that competition. So in stroke play, it's not one against the other, it's one against everybody. When we have the regular form of stroke play, what a lot of us play over here in the States. I know across the pond it's a little bit different, but when we talk about individual stroke play, which is our predominating form of play here in the States, we're talking about a player or a side score for the round. That's the total number of strokes on the scorecard, both talent and penalty strokes, that it takes to hole out on all the holes added up over the whole round. When we have a winner in stroke play, it's the side or the individual that has the lowest score at the end of either one round or all rounds combined. The lowest score wins in stroke play. Like we mentioned when we started here, we can play a lot of different forms of stroke play. It doesn't always have to be just regular individual stroke play. We have a possibility to play Stableford, max score, par bogey. There's a bunch of different forms of individual or partner stroke play that we can play that ultimately boil down to the same form of stroke play, just different scoring methods there. And we see again, we can either play as an individual or as a side. So we'll jump into some central elements of every competition. We already kind of went over those basic definitions of what is match play and stroke play and how they kind of relate to each other. But we have a lot of those key differences. Match play, we're playing against the opponent versus playing against the entire field in stroke play. In match play, they're really 18 one-hole contests, if you want to think of the round that way. It's not necessarily an 18-hole round like it might be in stroke play. They're really 18 different matches happening over the course of the round. So a little bit different way of thinking of match play versus stroke play there. The biggest key differences between the two forms of play is what we call the general penalty. General penalty comes up pretty often in the rule book. In the two forms of play, they're very different. In stroke play, a lot of us know the general penalty is getting a two-stroke penalty. However, when we get the general penalty in match play, it's just a loss of hole. The hole's over, our opponent has won, or we have won if the opponent gets that penalty. So a little bit of a difference there between those two penalties between match play and stroke play. One stroke penalties still apply the same way in both forms of play. It's just one stroke. And a disqualification applies the same way in both forms of play. The player's just disqualified. That general penalty really has that key difference there between the two forms of play. Again, we have the ability to concede either strokes, the hole, or the match in match play. In stroke play, we don't have that concession right. We got a hole out. So again, we're just trying to keep in mind all these key differences when we're talking about the difference between match play and stroke play. See a lot of the same things here. Match play, we already went over that. Stroke play, all players are competing with one another based on total score, adding up that total score. A lot of the same rules apply in both forms of play. When we look at the entire rule book, 1 through 25, a lot of the same rules are going to apply whether we're playing match play and stroke play. When we start diving a little bit deeper into each of those rules, there's going to be a few nuances between a lot of the sub rules that only apply in one form of play or the other. And we have the call outs to the committee procedures section. We don't really have to worry too much about that tonight. We're not going to dive that deep into the book, but talks about there if we're going to combine both forms of play into one round and how to apply the rules there. I already saw our other forms of stroke play covered by Rule 21. And just like when we talked about rules 1 through 25 applying both match play and stroke play, when we're playing other forms of stroke play like Stableford, max score, par bogey, rules 1 through 20 are going to apply to those as well. They're just going to be modified just a little bit to accompany the unique scoring formats there. We talked a little bit about this already, but we're either going to play as an individual or as a partner as part of a side of play. So whether we're playing match play or stroke play, these are really the two ways we're going to play. Again, when we have foursomes or four ball, we're going to modify those rules by rules 22 and 23. Rules 1 through 25, those are still going to apply. We're still going to use a lot of the same rules, whether it's match play or stroke play. We're just going to alter them a little bit depending on if we have a partner or not. And if we have a team, we're going to alter them a little bit more with Rule 24. So something we haven't really dove into yet is gross scores versus net scores. I know a lot of us play in leagues where the predominant form of scoring is net scoring, where a handicap is really a core principle of that league. And you need a handicap to compete, because if you don't have a handicap, there's no way to compare your scores to all the other players in that league or that competition. So I know a lot of us play net competitions in our leagues or at our home clubs or whatever the case is. But a lot of us play gross competitions as well. If you play higher level competitions like our CGA championships, USGA qualifying, maybe your club championship or stuff like that, a lot of that might be based on gross scores versus net scores. Typically, when we talk about gross scores, we refer to them as a scratch competition. No handicaps are applied. We're not using handicap at all. You're not getting your pops on those certain holes you might typically get them on. It's just going to be the score you make by the strokes that you take during your round and the total number of those strokes. Again, that handicap is not applied when we're talking about a scratch competition. But when we're talking about a handicap competition, we are going to use that in determining your net score. Again, we're going to take the gross score first, whatever score you make based on the strokes you actually take in the round. And then we're going to adjust those by your handicap strokes you're allocated on the scorecard. And that's how we're going to get your net score. And we do this so differing abilities can compete with each other in an equitable manner. If someone who is a 25 handicap wants to play with someone who's a 10 handicap, based on that handicap system and how those strokes allocate throughout the round, it's going to be able to do that to where those two players can play in an equitable manner. So let's talk a little bit more about match play. I know, like I mentioned before, I know stroke play seems to be the predominating form of play over here in the United States, but quite a bit of us do play match play. Here at the CGA, we have several match play championships where match play is the format. You might play match play at your home club for your club championship, or there might just be a match play competition at your home club. but match play is played quite frequently, even though most of the time, a lot of us do play stroke play. So we have a few sections to talk about. We have to talk about how we determine the result of a hole or the match. We'll talk about those concessions on how to concede those certain things we talked about, applying handicaps in a handicap match, and then the responsibilities of the player and the opponent. This is kind of where a lot of the key differences between match play and stroke play come into play. We already talked a little bit about match play having specific rules about concessions, giving information about strokes taken, the scorecard, things like that. So one thing about match play that's really important is that because it's you and your opponent, or your side and your opponent's side, it's like it's its own little bubble. Match play, I like to think of match play as this, it's just no one else in the world is worried about your match besides you and your opponents. You two are the only people who have an interest in the result of this match, how this match plays out. So that's why I kind of consider match play this little bubble. Anyone outside that bubble, they have no standing with how your match plays, what the result of your match is. Only you and your opponent are in this little match play bubble with each other. That's because you compete against each other on every hole. Remember, we have those 18 one-hole matches with match play. We compete with each other on every hole. You can see each other's play throughout the entire round, right? In stroke play, when you have a bunch of other players on the golf course, you have no idea how those players are playing their round or what they're doing. So in match play, it's a little bit different. Well, with the entire round, you're seeing your opponent make every single stroke. And a big key difference in match play is you're the one who has to protect your own interests. Again, like I said, it's this little bubble where it's only you and your opponent, and you're the only two who have a stake in this match. So because it's just you two, you got to look out for you. You got to be the one to protect your own interests in the match. Well, how do we win a hole in match play? Well, we already briefly touched about this, but we win a hole in match play when we complete the hole in fewer strokes, including penalty strokes, than our opponents. So if I make a 4 on a hole and my opponent makes a 5, well, I made fewer strokes on that hole than my opponent, so I win the hole based on those scores. Or we have the opportunity to concede the hole. If I'm making my 6th stroke from the bushes and my opponent is safely on the green in 2 strokes with a look at birdie, I know I'm probably not going to have a chance to beat that score, and I really don't want to play that hole anymore and potentially lose any more balls. So I have the option just to concede the hole. Hey, you're good, pick it up, you won the hole, let's move on. I have that option in match play to concede that hole. No requirement for me to get the ball in the hole. I don't have to hole out. I can just pick it up. I lost the hole. Let's move on to the next one. Or the opponent or myself, we can get the general penalty. Like I mentioned before in match play, that general penalty is a little bit different. It's not 2 strokes, it's a loss of hole. So when one of us, whether it's the player or the opponent, as soon as they get the general penalty by doing something that breaches a rule that gets that penalty, the hole's over. Whoever got the general penalty, they lose the hole, hole's over, move on to the next one. One big thing about match play, when we do have those concessions, or when a hole relies on a certain stroke to win that hole, when we have a ball in motion that the player is putting, and that ball either needs to go in the hole to either tie the hole or win the hole, or whatever the case is, usually just to tie the hole, excuse me, not necessarily to win the hole. We can make a concession, or we can concede that stroke by deliberately deflecting that ball. So if I am already in the hole for 5 and my opponent has a putt for 5 to tie that hole, and that's the only possible result that that player can get on that hole is 5, and it rolls by that hole and it's not coming back and there's no way the ball can be holed. If the ball is still in motion and I kick that ball back to my opponent, there's no penalty to me, and we're just going to move on. Yeah, no reasonable chance for that ball to be holed. Result of the hole has been decided and the player wins the hole. I don't get a penalty for deliberately deflecting that ball in motion to kick it back to my opponent. When we have a hole that's tied, I know a lot of people still have some old terminology that they call it halved or having a hole. When we have a hole that is tied, whereas I and my opponent complete the hole in the same number of strokes. We both maybe had fives on the hole. Both of us got the ball in the hole in 5 strokes. We have that hole tied, or we can agree to treat the hole as being tied. That's another one of the things that's unique in match play is that we can decide amongst ourselves, we can make an agreement to treat a hole as being tied. There is one caveat to tying or to treating a hole as tied. It's only allowed after one person has made a stroke to begin that hole. The best example of this is if we're both standing on it in the teeing area, we both hit a tee shot. Maybe both of us went out of bounds and none of us like this hole. This hole is maybe our nemesis. We just can't seem to play this hole well. We both just hit a shot out of bounds. Well, me and my opponent could just say, do you want to tie this hole and move on to the next one? In match play, that agreement is permitted. As long as at least one player has hit a stroke on that hole, we can make an agreement to treat the hole as being tied and we'll move on to the next one. Well, as we move on the match, and maybe my opponent's won some holes, maybe I've won some holes, we're trading off, and we're tying some holes. We eventually have to figure out who's going to win this match. We either win the match when we lead the opponent by more holes than remain to be played. Again, in this example, we see on that scorecard, there's 3 holes left to be played. One player is up by 4. There's no possible way that opponent can come back even by winning all the remaining holes. So because there's more holes, or the player is up by more holes that remain to be played, that match is over. We've determined a winner. Just like in conceding a stroke, if we're standing on the 15th hole and I'm 3 down and I know for sure that I'm not going to win any of these couple holes, and I don't want to keep playing. I'm running out of balls. Maybe it's I'm getting tired. I can just concede the match, or my opponent can concede the match, and that's the end of it. The match is over at that point. The match has been conceded. We move on. Or kind of like when we're determining the winner of a hole and a general penalty comes up, when a player or an opponent gets disqualified, that's when the match ends right then and there. When a disqualification penalty comes up, the match is over. We've determined a winner because someone has been disqualified from the match. It's possible we might have a tied match in certain terms of the competition, or in your local rules, or whatever, or maybe your league or your club. It's possible that a committee might say that a match can be tied, or someone has to be a winner. In our CGA match play in the early rounds, it's possible that a match might end in a tie, and that's the end of the match. But when we need to determine a winner and we get to the end of 18 holes and we have a match that is tied, we have the opportunity to extend a match. When the match is extended, we just extend it 1 hole at a time. It's kind of like sudden death and stroke play. When we need to break a tie in stroke play and we have sudden death, we're just going to take it 1 hole at a time until we have a winner, until somebody wins a hole to then win that match. An important thing to know about when we extend a match, unlike in stroke play, when we're extending a match that's been tied, it's still part of the same round. It's still the same match. In stroke play, when we go to a playoff, and we'll see this in 3.3, when we go to a playoff in stroke play, it's a new round. We're starting a brand new round. The last round is over. We have a new round as part of the playoff and stroke play. In match play, we're just continuing the same round. It's just a continuation of that same match. We typically are going to play the holes in the same order, but sometimes the committee might have us play in a different order. Maybe going back to hole number 1 isn't an option because the tee sheet is now reopened to the public, or whatever the case is. So sometimes the committee might allow a different order when we're continuing a tied match. Again, just like in our CGA match play in the early rounds, our terms of the competition tell us that we can end a match in a tie. Sometimes that in a Ryder Cup style format, or whatever the case is, you'll see that matches end in ties there when you earn points for a team, or whatever the case might be there. But sometimes our terms of the competition might tell us that, hey, if you're tied after 18, that's the end of the match. You just end up tied. The result is final. This might be a little bit different depending on the way your committee or your league or your terms of the competition lay this out. But typically a match becomes final when it's either recorded on a scoreboard or on a TV or somewhere else, or when it's reported by someone as part of the committee. We have this as part of our CGA match play. That when a result is final, it's been that when a match is final, that result has been reported to someone on the committee. And a call out to our committee procedures. We won't dive too deep into that. All right, concessions. We've touched a little bit on this now, but let's dive into concessions. This is a match play specific function of the rules. This only comes in match play. We don't have the ability to concede in stroke play, but like I mentioned before, we can concede three things: either the player's next stroke, we can concede the hole we are playing, or we can concede the match as a whole. So when we're conceding the player's next stroke, we can do it any time before the next stroke is made. So if a player is either lining up a putt or they're getting ready to hit and they haven't hit yet and made that stroke yet, we still have the opportunity to make that concession and say that next stroke is good. The opponent has then completed the hole with a score that includes that conceded stroke, right? It's not really, a lot of people have a misconception that when a stroke is conceded and that stroke wasn't made, it doesn't count. When we concede a stroke, we're essentially saying that that stroke would have gone in the hole. So that stroke is counting in that player's score. So when that stroke has been conceded, the hole is over for that player. They have completed the hole as if they would have holed out with the score that includes that stroke. And at that point, the ball is no longer in play. It can be removed by anyone, player, caddy, opponent. It's no longer a ball in play. However, when we make a stroke or we make a concession to a stroke that the ball is in motion, right? Maybe a player has hit that ball and it's 10 feet from the hole and it's still rolling, and then the concession is made. Well, unfortunately, that doesn't apply to the ball that is rolling. That's going to apply to the next stroke, right? Because when we make a concession for the next stroke, we have to make it before the stroke is made. So if the stroke is then made and then the concession is given, the stroke that just was made counts, and then the next stroke after that is conceded. So we saw there just now, John Augenstein, Andy Ogletree at the US Amateur. When that ball was almost to the hole, but we knew it wasn't going to go in, we heard Augenstein concede, hey, that next stroke's good. That ball was in motion. The putt that Andy Ogletree just hit, that counted, but he was conceding that next stroke as if he would have tapped that ball in to complete that hole. So when that concession's made while the ball's in motion, we're applying that to the next stroke after that. Unless that ball happens to be holed. Like I said, if that ball was putted from 10 feet away and I conceded it when it was 5 feet away from the hole, and then it keeps rolling, and then it drops in the hole and it's holed, well, my concession doesn't really matter because there is no next stroke to be made. The ball is just holed with the last stroke that was made, and that's the end of it. My concession, like it never even happened. And we can concede the next stroke by deflecting or stopping that opponent's ball in motion. We already saw this in a previous slide. Only if we're doing it to specifically concede the next stroke and when there's no reasonable chance that that ball can be holed. When we talk about conceding a hole, again, we can do this anytime before the hole is completed. If we're in the middle of the fairway or if we're on the putting green, wherever we are in the process of playing that hole, we can have the option just to concede the hole. And that also includes before we even start the hole. If we get up to the next tee box, and maybe it's a hole that I have never parred in my life, and I know my opponent is really good at certain, maybe a short par 3, and I know my opponent is really good with his wedges, and I know there's just absolutely no way I'm going to win this hole. None of us even have to hit a shot to concede this hole. I can just say, you know what, you take this hole. I don't even want to deal with it. Let's just go on to the next one. This is your hole here. It's not the same as agreeing to make that tie like we saw earlier. When we're agreeing to tie that hole, one of us has to make those strokes to start that hole. When we're just conceding it to our opponent, we're just giving that hole away. None of us have to hit a stroke to make that concession. We can just do it before the hole's even started and move on. However, we're not allowed to make those an agreement to concede holes for the purpose of shortening the match. Let's just say that both of us we're playing a match and we have stuff to do later in the day. Maybe, someone has to go pick up their kids. I have to go to a doctor's appointment. Hey, we don't have time to play an 18-hole match. Let's agree to concede, these 3 holes so we can have a shorter match. We can get on with our day. That agreement is not allowed. We are not allowed to just concede holes for the purpose of shortening our match. We see this statement a lot because there's a lot of things that can trigger this. But if we do so and we make this agreement knowing it's against the rules, both of us are disqualified. Both the player and the opponent that made that agreement, both players are disqualified from that match. And just like a hole or a stroke, we can concede the match at any time before it's decided. If I'm standing on the first tee and I am feeling really sick and I know I'm not going to be able to play that day and I'm just not wanting to play that match and I just, want to get out of there, whatever the case is, I can just tell my opponent, hey, I concede the match to you. Our match hasn't even started yet, but hey, I'm conceding your match, you've won. Yeah, anytime, even before we start the match. Well, how are concessions made? They're only made when we clearly communicate them in a couple different ways. We have to make that concession very clear when we're either conceding the hole, a stroke, or the match. You can either do it verbally, or we can do it with an action that clearly shows our intent to concede the stroke or the hole. Maybe, maybe one of these, hey, pick it up. That stroke's good. Thumbs up. Some action that clearly shows that that concession is being made. Sometimes we have false concessions or a misunderstanding of a concession. Maybe we didn't make it clear enough, or there was a gesture that was taken the wrong way. But if we have an opponent that lifts their ball, without marking it, or they thought they won the hole and they just pick up their ball because they misunderstood a concession, well, we're lucky. There's no penalty for this. We're just going to replace that ball back to where it was picked up from. It was an accident. We had a misunderstanding. Someone thought they got conceded a stroke or a hole or whatever the case was. That wasn't actually the case. There was just a genuine misunderstanding. No one's going to get penalized. We're just going to replace the ball and move on. Key thing about concessions is there is no going back once you make a concession. A concession is final and you cannot withdraw it. On the other side of that fence, your opponent can't decline the concession. If I concede a hole to my opponent says, no, I'm not going to accept your concession, not their choice. That concession cannot be declined, nor can I take it back once I have given the concession. So I always say that the concession cliff is a pretty steep one. Once you go over it, there's no going back. We'll talk a little bit now about match play with handicaps. We'll talk about net match play. I know some of us play this form of play quite frequently when we're using handicaps in a match to compete with somebody. Before a match starts, the player and the opponent should tell each other what their handicaps are before the match starts. It's good to know either how many strokes you're getting or your opponent's getting, or how those strokes line up with each other before the match begins. If someone declares a wrong handicap, either before they start, or maybe we're walking down the first hole and then we're talking about handicaps as we're walking down the first hole. If someone declares a wrong handicap, that could potentially have some bad consequences for the player or the opponents. So we could either declare a wrong handicap by saying we have a handicap that's too high or a handicap that's too low. There's two sides to that. If we do declare a handicap that's too high or too low, and we don't correct it before the next stroke is made by the opponent, well, we have two different outcomes. If we declare a handicap that's too high, maybe I'm actually a 10 handicap and I tell my opponent I'm 15, and that handicap is way too high. I know I'm going to get some extra strokes by declaring that handicap. And then my opponent goes on to make a stroke. Well, unfortunately, match is over. That player has just been disqualified for declaring a wrong handicap. Only if it affects the number of strokes that the player either gets or gives. If I declare that maybe again, in that example, when I'm a 15, when I'm really a 10, and I know I'm going to get those extra strokes out of it, because that affected the number of strokes given, that's going to get me disqualified. If I'm a 10 and I declare that I'm 11, and based on how those handicap strokes shake out, if that doesn't affect the number of strokes given, there's no penalty, no disqualification in that case. Then we're just going to get away with declaring that handicap that's too high. If I declare a handicap that's too low, on the other hand, again, maybe I'm a 10 in reality, but I tell my opponent I'm a 5. Well, there's really no benefits to me by doing that, or there's no gained advantage there. What I'm going to have to do is I'm going to get stuck with that lower number being declared. Maybe the only thing I'm going to do is cheat myself out of the strokes that I probably should have gotten by declaring a handicap that was correct to begin with. So when the handicap is too low, no penalty. You're just going to get stuck with the strokes that, or not getting the strokes that you should have gotten in that case. Well, we have handicap strokes. We get them per hole. We're not applying handicap over the total score at the end. We're getting them per hole. A lot of us know these as pops or dots. However, our handicaps are laid out throughout the round. We're given those by hole based on that handicap of the hole on the scorecard. When we're playing net match play, when those handicaps are being applied, the lower net score is going to win the hole. So if we see in this example here with Aaron and Zabrinski on our screen, we take that 8th hole there where someone's getting a handicap stroke, where Aaron's making a 5, Zabrinski is making a 4. Maybe in this case, Zabrinski is getting a handicap stroke or Aaron is getting a handicap stroke. Wherever that lower net score is between them, that lower net score is going to win the hole in net match play. When we have a tied match in net match play, handicap strokes are typically given out the same way as they were throughout your round. When we're continuing back on to holes we've already played, typically we're going to get those handicap strokes given out hole by hole, same way throughout the round, unless the committee sets a different way in doing so. We have some responsibilities in match play here. We need to know where we're getting those strokes. That's the player's responsibility to know where they're giving the handicap strokes based on those allocations. That allocation is set by the committee. Again, usually you're going to get a scorecard that's already been dotted or that already has been outlined where those strokes are being given or get based on what the committee has already given you. But it is the player's responsibility to know where those strokes are and where they fall throughout your round. If we make a mistake or, if we screw up or if we just fail to apply handicaps or we mistakenly apply handicap strokes throughout our round and we go on, we don't realize it, but we agree on the results of that hole, well, the agreed result is just going to stand. Unfortunately, in match play, when we agree on a hole and we move on, we continue through our round and making strokes, that agreed result of that hole is going to stand. Unless we correct it in time, and we have a couple examples here of correcting that in time. We either got to do it before we begin play on the next hole. So if we play hole number 4, we agree that maybe someone won the hole based on 4 versus 5 or 5 versus 6. And maybe we didn't apply those strokes in match or apply those handicap strokes. And we go on to start hole number 5. We have unfortunately lost our window of time to correct that mistake. And again, for the final hole of the round, before we go report that score to the committee, or before that score gets posted on a scoreboard, or however the committee decides that the match is over. A couple of responsibilities in match play between the player and the opponents. Again, we have to tell the opponent a correct number of strokes taken. It's our responsibility to tell opponents about any penalties we get. We got to know the match score. And like we mentioned earlier, we have the ability to protect our own rights and interests in match play. Anytime during the play of a hole or after a hole is completed, maybe before we move on to the next hole, your opponent might ask you how many strokes you made on that previous hole, or what do you lie, or what's your next stroke to be taken. Your opponent might ask for that information, or they want to have that information, probably to base their own strategy or how they're going to play their next shot, or whatever they're formulating in their head. They need to know that information. Again, to allow the opponent to decide how to play the next stroke, the hole, or just to confirm the results of the hole just completed. They want to make sure they understood the results of that hole or how that hole played out. They want to make sure that they're on the same page and understanding that result. When either your opponent or you ask your opponent about those number of strokes taken, or when you're giving that information without being asked, we got to give the right number of strokes. There's no benefit to lying here in match play. When we're asked for that information and we're going to give that information, we got to give that the right number of strokes taken. If we refuse to respond to that request, or if we just say nothing, or if we say it's not, like in this example on the screen, it's none of your business, it's going to be treated as if we gave the wrong number of strokes. So saying nothing in this case isn't exactly a way out of having to give the right number of strokes taken, or giving that information to your opponent. If we fail to do so, or if we give the wrong number of strokes, we're going to get the general penalty. We're going to have a loss of hole in this scenario, unless we correct that mistake in time. We're going to have to do that before the opponent makes another stroke. Maybe we're in the middle of the fairway. The opponent asks us, hey, how many strokes do you lie? If I don't respond, or I don't give that correct information before that opponent makes their next stroke, that's when the loss of hole penalty kicks in, and I'm going to lose the hole. Or taking a similar action like conceding the next player's stroke or conceding the hole. Those are treated the same as making another stroke. So again, there's no benefit to lying or staying silent in this scenario. Whenever you're asked for the number of strokes you've taken or what do you lie, just give the right answer. Makes everyone's life a lot easier. When that hole is completed, maybe we're waiting to tee off on the next hole, or we're between holes and we're asked for that right number of strokes and we don't give that information, we got to correct that before someone either makes a stroke to begin that next hole, or again, takes a similar action like conceding the next hole, or just conceding the match as a whole. We do have one exception to this rule. There's a lot of exceptions that pop up throughout the rule book. 3.2D is no different. We do have an exception here. There is no penalty, though, if that does not affect the results of the hole or the match, or if there's no misunderstanding there. If we give the wrong number of strokes taken after a hole is completed, but it doesn't affect the understanding of whether the hole was won, lost, or tied, there's not going to be a penalty. If I won the hole with a 4 and my opponent lost the hole with a 5, and then he asked me, hey, what did you win that hole with? And I say a 3. Well, I just gave him the wrong number of strokes, but it doesn't change his understanding of that he lost that hole or she lost that hole. Even though it was the wrong information, they still have an understanding that they lost the hole, and that everything has stayed the same. So when there's no effect on the results of that hole or that information being given, we don't have that loss of hole penalty. There's just no penalty in that scenario. Granted, you should still tell your opponent the right number of strokes, even if there is no penalty and there's no misunderstanding. Just tell them the right number of strokes and there's no issue. When we get a penalty, a lot of times throughout a match, sometimes we might get a penalty. Maybe we take relief from a penalty area, or we have an unplayable ball, or maybe our ball moved and we caused it to move. When we get a penalty, we got to tell our opponent about that penalty as soon as possible. Sometimes it might be really easy as soon as possible. They might be standing right next to you. Hey, just FYI, I took relief there for a 1-stroke penalty. Or sometimes we might not be able to tell them until we get up to the green. But, there's some times where our opponent might be 100 yards away. We're just going to tell them as soon as possible about that penalty. Weirdly enough, it applies even if you don't know about the penalty. Even, maybe you're unaware of a penalty if we're moving your ball in the middle of the fairway. Players are expected to know the rules and know when they breached a rule. And we're expected to know and identify those situations and tell our opponent about those. Even when we are unsure about a penalty or we don't know about a penalty, it's still the responsibility of the player or the opponent to bring some of those facts to light when we're playing match play. If we fail to do so and we don't correct that mistake before our opponent makes another stroke, or again, takes similar action like a concession, we're going to get the general penalty. This is solely because that understanding of how many strokes a player has taken, or if there's a penalty that's involved in the player's play, it's going to affect the strategy of the opponent and how they decide to play that match or play that hole. So when those things come up, we got to tell our opponent so they can try and make the right decisions for themselves. We have another exception. There's no penalty when the opponent knew of a player's penalty. So if someone's watching you take relief, or they're watching you take an unplayable ball, or they watched you move it and there was some acknowledgement there, there's no penalty if you fail to tell them about it because they watched you do it or they observed it for themselves. So they don't need to be notified a second time about the penalty there. So no penalty when your opponent already knew about that occurrence. Knowing the match score, we already talked a little bit about knowing the match score here. And players are expected to know the match score. It's, again, this is you and your opponent. You're the only two people involved here. You got to know the match score. If you mistakenly agree on a wrong match score, you can either correct it before someone makes a stroke or before the final hole, before that result becomes final. If we don't correct it, that match score becomes the actual match. The wrong score becomes that actual match score. So if we're on the 16th hole and we mistakenly agree that, hey, I'm 2 up when I might actually only be 1 up, and we both mistakenly agree that that's the match score and we go on and tee off on 17, guess what? Someone's now 2 up in that match. That wrong match score now became the actual match score. See another exception here when we request a ruling in time. If we make a timely request for a ruling, and it's because the opponent either gave the wrong number of strokes or failed to tell the player about the penalty, we can correct that wrong match score. We do have the opportunity, a window of opportunity to correct a wrong match score. And our last piece of match play here, protecting our own rights and interests. Again, I've already mentioned this a few times. You and the opponent are the only two people involved in this match. If you believe a player has breached a rule or the opponent has breached a rule, as a player, I can either choose to act or not act on that breach. In match play, it's perfectly fine for someone to overlook a breach of the rules that carries a penalty. We can't make an agreement to break the rules if we both know that there's, a penalty here or waiving a penalty or, doing something else. We cannot make that agreement. In the previous example, overlooking a penalty, that's a solo endeavor. One person is choosing to overlook that breach. When we have an agreement, there's 2 players there that are coming together to make that agreement. That's not allowed. We're going to get a disqualification if we make an agreement to not apply the rules or to waive a penalty. If we have a referee assigned to our match, that a referee is going to be responsible for acting on any breach of the rules that they either see or are told about. So when we have a referee brought into our match, there's kind of this third party that now has some interest in your match and has the ability to kind of oversee what the 2 players might not. Kind of getting close to the end of our time here, but we'll speed through stroke play to kind of end our night. We might go a few minutes over, so Apologies to anyone that I might have to hop off right at 7 o'clock, but we'll speed through stroke play here. We have three distinct parts of stroke play: determining a winner in stroke play, how we score in stroke play, including on our scorecard, and our failure to hole out. We got to get the ball in the hole on each of those 18 holes in stroke play. Got specific rules that are different from match play versus stroke play. Like in match play, we're only competing against our opponent. In stroke play, we are competing against everyone else in that competition. Got to treat all players equally under the rules. After the round of stroke play, we have a player and a marker who needs to certify each hole on the scorecard, make sure that all the holes are right, everything is accurate, and we get that scorecard returned to the committee. We have a winner in stroke play, and that's the player who completes all rounds in the fewest total strokes. Maybe it's 1 round, maybe it's 4 rounds. Whoever completes all those rounds in the fewest strokes, they're going to be the winner in stroke play. When we have a handicap competition, that also includes net strokes. So in the previous example, we were talking about gross strokes. When we have a handicap competition, we're going to factor in net strokes. And the committee usually decides how ties will be decided in stroke play based on our terms of the competition. Scoring in stroke play is specifically kept on a scorecard. This is one thing that is different from match play. In match play, there is no scorecard. There sometimes is an informal scorecard in match play where there's a piece of paper or something that's been given out so players can keep track of the match, but that is not a scorecard. A scorecard only applies when we're dealing with stroke play. Because we have a scorecard that needs to be kept in stroke play, we also have a marker that we don't have in match play. Marker and scorecard, those two things are stroke play specific. See the definition of scorecard here, the document where a player's score for each hole is entered in stroke play. I have an example of Tom Watson's scorecard from the US Open back in whenever, the 82nd US Open. Not sure when that one was done, but we see a scorecard here. It's got a place to enter scores hole by hole. It's got some total lines, and it's got 2 lines there for certifications by the marker and the competitor. Scorecard may be in any form, either paper or electronic. If you play in any CGA events over the last handful of years, you'll know that we use electronic scoring in CGA events. Sometimes at your home course or in your league, you might still use paper scorecards. Either form is fine as long as it is approved by the committee. Got to be able to enter each score for each hole. Got to be able to certify the scores by physical signature or in the form of electronic scoring, some sort of electronic certification. Not required in match play, like I just mentioned, but it might be used to help players keep score in the match. Let me see our definition of marker: person responsible for entering that player's score on the scorecard and also certifying that scorecard once the round is over. Can be any other player in stroke play that serves as our marker. But when we're playing forms of stroke play that involve sides, like 4-ball or foursomes, our marker cannot be our partner, cannot have someone that's part of our same side being the marker. Sometimes the committee might tell you who your marker is. They might designate a marker when they're passing out scorecards at the beginning of a round, or they might let you choose who your marker is. Hey, here's your scorecard, exchange it with somebody else. They're going to be your marker. Saw that already. Scorecard is kept, scores on the card by the marker. Typically, we have to have the same marker throughout our entire round. Once a marker has been designated as your marker at the beginning of the round, typically they're going to be your whole marker for all 18 holes. Unless the committee either approves a change before or after it happens. Maybe somebody withdraws, they're feeling sick, they pull out, they're not going to finish the round. Someone might be able to choose to switch that marker. The committee might make a switch of the marker for you. Couple things about scoring in stroke play. Zip through these ones real quick. The marker's responsibility, the player's responsibility. wrong score for a hole, how we score in a handicap competition, and the player's responsibility for adding up those scores. See an example of a scorecard here in some highlighted areas. We see a light pink or orangish shaded area. Those are the markers' responsibilities. They got to input the scores hole by hole for all 18 holes, and they got to sign off at the end of the round and certify that that scorecard is correct. So those are the responsibilities of the marker, or if you have multiple markers, making sure that your multiple markers have fulfilled all of those requirements. The round is ended. The marker got to certify those scores on the scorecard. If you add more than one marker, typically each marker must certify those scores for the holes that they were the marker. But if one of those markers saw you play all of those holes, let's just say they were the third person in your group, halfway through the round, they became your marker. That person can certify all of those holes because they saw you play all of those holes. There's not necessarily a requirement anymore to get two different certifications if you have more than one marker. It's possible that your marker might refuse to certify your scorecard if they believe something is wrong. If there's a vast disagreement on the results of a hole in stroke play, it's possible that a marker might refuse to certify a player's score at the end of the round. When that typically happens, the committee's got to step in. They got to consider all the evidence brought forth to them, all the facts that they need to know, and usually the committee is going to make a decision on that player's score for that specific hole. So when there's a refusal of certification from the marker, that's when the committee steps in, and the committee is going to be the one who makes the decision. If the marker then still refuses to certify that scorecard, maybe they're just standing firm. They just don't believe that that's the correct result, and that information is not leading them to that score. The committee is going to be the one that ultimately can certify the scorecard and make it valid, or they can accept certification from someone else who saw those actions. So ultimately, when we have this situation, it's going to boil down to that committee making the ultimate call. If we have a marker that knowingly certifies a wrong score and they still go on to do it, that marker is going to be disqualified or should be disqualified. In this case, that the word should there in the rules, that's not necessarily an auto disqualification. It's really just what the committee should do. Doesn't necessarily lead them to being disqualified, but typically the rules are going to tell us the committee should disqualify a marker for certifying the wrong score. See an example of a marker strip that has been torn off a scorecard. We're probably all familiar with these strips on scorecards. When a player is marking for someone else or a marker has their own scorecard, they should keep track of their own scores. That's what the marker strip is for. The round is ended. A lot of people do this already. They take that strip, they rip it off their scorecard, compare it to their own scorecard, make sure everything matches up the way it should, everything looks correct. And that's what they usually do before they go on and certify their own scorecard. After a marker has certified those scores and given us our scorecard back, we can't change those scores. Those scores are there. We need our marker with us to be able to change something. We can't just go and change those all by ourselves. Again, we need the marker's agreement or committee approval. We can't just go and change a 5 to a 4 once the marker is certified just because that's what we want to do. When we do that, though, we don't need extra certification of the scorecard. We don't need that extra little initial next to the score or another signature. Once we have the marker's agreement and maybe we made a mistake and we changed a hole, we just need to make that change, and that's all good. Don't need extra certification there. As a player, I also have to certify the scores on my own scorecard, and we got to return it to the committee. Again, we see some examples there in our shaded scorecard of what the player and the marker need to certify. We need to certify those whole scores. We need to make sure there's 2 signatures on our scorecard. That is all the player's responsibility. If we breach any of those requirements, if something isn't right on our scorecard or something's not snuffing up to par, maybe there's a score missing in the hole by hole scores, or we didn't sign our scorecard. If we breach any of those rules, we are disqualified. Seen it happen multiple times where someone failed to sign their scorecard. We had an example at the Colorado Open last year where a player had 17 scores on their scorecard and hole 18 was missing, and they turned their scorecard in, was not caught in time. That player was unfortunately disqualified. In that particular case at the Colorado Open, that player had shot a 62 in that round. So that was a pretty painful disqualification to make for that specific player. We do see one exception to 3.3b. There is no penalty when the marker failed to carry out their responsibilities. If the marker didn't sign their scorecard and then they took off really quickly and the player, couldn't stop them, or the player didn't realize it, and they bring it to the committee and the committee can't get a hold of them, the player can't get a hold of them, but we can't get that marker to sign that scorecard, and we did everything possible to prevent that from happening or to rectify that scenario, we're not going to be penalized. And under this rule, we're just going to say, it's okay. The marker failed to carry out their responsibilities, but it wasn't the player's fault. It was beyond that player's control. The committee is not going to disqualify the player. There's going to be no penalty here. And we're just seeing a call out about how to define when a scorecard has been returned. A little bit different for everybody. It needs to be usually defined in your terms of the competition. Some leagues, some clubs, some organizations, they might define differently when that scorecard has been returned to the committee. And we have a model local rule that reduces the penalty for returning a scorecard without whole scores being certified. The CGA uses this model local rule. Again, when we have that breach of that rule, it's usually disqualification. With model local rule L1, it reduces that penalty down to a general penalty on the final hole of a player's round. So when we turn a scorecard in and we don't have a signature on it, but we have this model local rule in place, player's not going to be disqualified. We're just going to add 2 strokes onto their final hole, and that's going to be how they turn their scorecard in. Try and wrap up here in the next few minutes. I know we're a little bit over, but we have a couple slides left and we're at the end. But when we have a wrong hole for on a scorecard, right? We have the wrong score for a hole, and we return that scorecard with that wrong score. We have 2 different outcomes. If we return that score with a higher than the actual score, higher score is just going to count. Famous scenario here, Robert DiVincenzo at the Masters a handful of years ago returned a score for a higher score on his scorecard than he actually made. A tough break there for Robert DiVincenzo, signed for an incorrect score that was higher than what he actually made. That score stood. We heard a call out to the old Rule 6. This is now 3-3. But the wrong score stood. He just has to live with it. Finished 1 score behind the champion, or 1 stroke behind the champion. So tough break there when we finish with a higher score. When we return a lower score than what we actually made, or we return something with no score, like we had in the Colorado Open example I just gave there, we're going to have a very different outcome there. We're going to have a disqualification. Another short little clip here. Again, very different outcome there based on signing for a lower score than you actually made. We're going to have that disqualification penalty. We do have one exception. If we have a failure to include a penalty we didn't know we incurred throughout the round, maybe we wrote a 4 on our card because that's what we think we made on that hole, but we incurred an unknown penalty that brought our score up to 5. we're not going to get the disqualification penalty. What's going to happen is, if that mistake is found, we're just going to include those penalty strokes that should have been included. We're just going to revise your score, include the penalty strokes that we did get that we didn't know about, and we're going to move on. That exception does not apply, however, when that penalty is disqualification. If we got a one-stroke penalty or a two-stroke penalty we didn't know about, we're just going to add the 1 or 2 to the score. When we get a disqualification we didn't know about, that's not going to save us in this scenario. We're just going to get disqualified. We're going to get that penalty we should have gotten. Or it does not apply when the player was told that a penalty might apply and did not raise that with the committee before returning your scorecard. So if you're informed after you come off a hole that you might get a penalty of 1 stroke for doing this during that hole, and you don't bring that up with the committee and that penalty ends up applying, this exception is not going to help us out here. Unfortunately, we're going to be disqualified. Last 2 or 3 slides here. This is new in 2023. This did not apply before the start of last year, but there is no requirements for a player's handicap to be shown on the scorecard or for a player to add up their own scores. That was always the case, but this is more so for the handicap that got added last year. The player returns a scorecard when they have either made a mistake in applying the handicap or showing the handicap. There's no penalty because that responsibility ultimately is going to fall on the committee. That is a committee responsibility. It is not the player's responsibility. So if there is an error or mistake made when dealing with the handicap strokes, that is going to be a committee responsibility to fix that. Committee is ultimately responsible for adding up the scores, calculating those handicap strokes, using it to apply to get the net score. All of that is the committee's responsibility. So players only responsible for those 18 scores in the hole boxes and the 2 signatures. We have another model local rule that might put that responsibility back on the player. So there is a model local rule there that transports us back before 2023, but not widely used. The CGA doesn't use it. So again, all the player's responsible for is those hole scores and the 2 signatures, making sure everything looks correct there. Last piece tonight for stroke play is our failure to hole out. Like we mentioned a few times throughout this presentation, we need to hole out in stroke play. We have to have a score for every single hole. When we talk about hole out, we're talking about that ball being at rest in the hole after a stroke, and the entire ball is below the surface of the putting green. And the rules refer to holing out or hole outs. That's when the player's ball has been holed. We have a special case of the ball resting against the flagstick. As of 2019, as we all know, or we might not know, we can leave the flagstick in the hole while making strokes from the putting green. We now have this special case of a ball resting against the flagstick in the hole. Sometimes that ball might not be fully submerged beneath the surface of the putting green, like we saw in the previous slide. When we have any part of that ball that is below the surface of the putting green, oops, go back here. We're going to treat it as being holed. If any part of that ball is resting against the flagstick and both in the hole and some part of that ball is below the surface of the putting green, we're treating that ball as being holed. Got to hole out at each hole in the round. If we fail to hole out at any hole, whether it's 1 through 17 or even the 18th hole, we got to correct that mistake. We got to do it before we make a stroke to begin the next hole. If I'm on the 4th hole and I just scoop my ball up and I put it in my pocket and I go on to the next hole, if I fail to hole out and then tee off on that next hole, going to be disqualified. I did not correct that mistake in time. There might be some other penalties attached to that, like lifting my ball without marking it or whatever the case might be. But if we don't correct that mistake before we move on to the next hole by failing to hole out, we're going to get the ultimate penalty of disqualification. Some other forms of stroke play that might let us get away with that: Stableford, max score, par bogey. where the scoring is a little bit different. If a player doesn't hole out in those forms of play, that might not necessarily get them disqualified. In Stableford, if I reach a max score or I can't get any points on that hole, I can pick that ball up and not be disqualified by failing to hole out in those other forms of stroke play. And then there is just a short review about our elements of what we covered tonight: match play versus stroke play, the definitions, our purpose statements for each one, and then the 3 parts of Rule 3.